Well, welcome back. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and we're going to continue our conversation as part of the Global Climate, Tech, and Policy Forum today as part of World Government Summit with a conversation with Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fouad, the Minister of Environment of the Arab Republic of Egypt. It's much a pleasure to be here with the Minister and to avoid taking up too much time and recognizing the Minister has a hard stop and we've gone a little bit late today. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Minister Fouad, whose extensive experience in climate change through her diverse background working in academia, government, NGOs, international organizations. Among her many ongoing efforts in advancing the climate agenda, Minister Fouad acts as Egypt's national focal point for the Green Climate Fund, has been selected as the lead author of Chapter 4 of the upcoming IPCC report. Needless to say, Minister Fouad is a powerhouse on these issues, and as you can tell, is an impactful climate champion. As we come back from COP27 just this past November in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was quite a bit of progress, and we're excited to continue the momentum from COP27 through Egypt's presidency to COP28. I know there's a tremendous amount of collaboration. And so I'm just going to jump in the conversation. Minister Fouad, it's really great to be here with you. Reflecting on Sharm el-Sheikh and some of the successes there, what do you want to see mature further as we seek to close the gap on climate change from ambition to actual tangible action?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And let me thank the World Government Summit also for putting the climate very high on the agenda this year. But also, I think that the climate agenda is always one step follows the other. So you cannot disconnect. From COP27, where pledges went into implementation, it's important first to keep the momentum going and making sure that there is actual implementation on the ground that could be further replicated and upscaled. And here we're talking about the technologies, the finance that should be accompanied to that, as well as the capacity development that should be part of that process. Another important agenda item that should be there, you know, the balance that came out in COP27 from the loss and damage, the fund for the loss and damage, together with the package that relates to moving the mitigation work program forward, is also something that we need to see in COP28, especially on two things: the global stocktake, as well as the global goal on adaptation, building on the momentum of the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, where there are 30 outcomes that came out of that. I think this is an opportunity that should not be missed at that point of time.
Well, we won't break down all 30 outcomes, but I do think we'll have time to think about finance and loss and damage, especially in the context of the global stocktake. So why don't we actually turn to this? When Dr. Sultan gave his inaugural address at the Global Energy Forum, the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum in Abu Dhabi last month, he made it very clear that the world's far behind in terms of achieving its climate ambition. And I think that that is perhaps something that we're intimately aware of, right? That we're going to take a global stocktake, that this will be the first one since that was put into place through the UNFCCC process. But that the prospects of that coming out, it's going to look bleak, that the report card is not going to be impressive. So we need change, and I think that that's what you started, and that's when you're talking about these outcomes in Egypt. What are the benchmarks? How do we measure success in terms of actually effectuating that change now in COP28?
You measure success when you see how the NDCs that have been updated is being implemented actually on the ground. The amount of finance that's being directed from different sources of finance and how they have been spent towards those indicators or those benchmarks. And one important factor also that was always not given much attention in COPs, which is not only the multi-stakeholder process dialogue, like in Egypt when we started the Decarbonization Day for the industry, is also very important to get those that are not part of the process to be an integral part of the process and see how their pathways can show their commitment.
I was just in a meeting with the Director General of COP28, Ambassador Majid Al-Zuwaidi, and he had a reflection that maybe you can also appreciate, which is the COP process when he was last involved was Paris, and it was getting the Paris Climate Agreement across the finish line. The diplomacy had really hit an apex, and he really is now looking for this opportunity of demonstrable change and action. And I think he was surprised that maybe that hadn't manifested further in the duration in the years between Paris and now. But he did note some key features at COP27, which was this aspect of inclusivity and the role of industry and other outside stakeholders, not necessarily part of the diplomatic process, but the doers getting action and deals accomplished. I think that's perhaps one of the signature elements of COP27 and Egypt's role in facilitating that. How can industry reconcile its position with public opinion surrounding the involvement and its role within climate change? I mean, I think that there's a lot of reflection on that right now with Dr. Sultan as ADNOC CEO and chairman of the board of Masdar as well.
One thing that we need to look at that from the strategic perspective, like when I mentioned to you that the decarbonization day that we had as one of the thematic days, and we know that there could be a heat coming out of that, but an inclusive COP means that we cannot leave anyone behind. One thing that needs to be done at that level is to show first what are their plans, those industries, and we can cluster those industries, okay? And it is there in the science, in the IPCC, so we're not reinventing the wheel or doing something that's not really the science tell us about. And then after that, see what can they do to the process and what can they offer to that process, and how can they really, by the technology that's happening today, by the digitalization, even by the economic development, when you link the industry and you link that cycle of the climate agenda and the sustainability, the industry will be the most beneficial ones from gaining those technologies and from adopting the sustainability and the climate practices, even from the economic perspective and from the revenues perspective. So they should show how they can do that kind of a change and that transition. And from the side of the government should also try to help and support that. So for example, in Egypt right now, even after the COP, we're trying to see how best can we accelerate the industry and their transition towards a greener and a cleaner environment. And what kind of support would they need? Would they need incentives? They need enabling environment, legislation, regulations, what kind of funding that could be available? How can they really move into that green transition without being pressured and without being really spelled what to speak about?
So if we're going to unlock businesses and industries' full potential, we're actually talking no longer about hundreds of billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars.
Exactly.
And I think, whether you're looking at the IEA or frankly any International Energy Organization is going to tell you that the amount of money is an opportunity, but until we unlock that, it's a challenge as well. And really want to get your perspective on where the financing can come from and how countries can be held accountable for delivering the financing on the public side as well. Like how can public money facilitate private financing? How do we securitize to get the energy transition funded at the scale it needs to be done?
First of all, we need to have to ensure that the part of the infrastructure is being part of the public budget, and not only for renewable energy, because renewable energy, when you come to talk about it, these are bankable projects. So all we need to do is to replicate and upscale and accelerate the process. Like Egypt, when in its updated NDC, we mentioned that we are approaching a 42% of our energy mix to be renewable energy by 2035. And then we said, no, we want to accelerate that further. So reaching up till 2030. So first you need to do that kind of a planning, replicating and upscaling. But also one important thing is to look at the other side of planning that to things that are essential for climate, but needs that public funding. For example, adaptation. When we plan, all countries now are doing their national adaptation planning. And part of the national adaptation planning is look at how the investment and bankability of adaptation can be done, but look what kind of projects that you need to put and integrate within the overall planning system and have that budget. And that requires an intensive multi-stakeholder, cross-cutting coordination mechanism that is not easy and cannot be done over months or a year. It needs a multiple of years for other stakeholders around the table to understand how to mainstream that, how that could be implemented, and how can that also be measured.
So do you think that element of multi-stakeholder engagement, you seeded the process a little bit in COP27. Are you going to see that continued through the COP28 process here in the UAE as well?
It has to continue. You know, even the UAE has started early by the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, when there were intensive discussion on climate here. When we are talking within the World Government Summit, we have that technology forum on climate. It has to keep the momentum going, because the COP28 would be successful if it's an inclusive, a multi-stakeholder, multi-dialogue that should take place beforehand and has to be framing that kind of discussion and be also part of the agenda of that. Because, for example, when we planned our COP27, there was part of the agenda that was taken over from COP26, but you need to see where are the entry points. For example, in Egypt, we discussed the entry point for the civil society, for the green zone, for the gender day, for the youth day. All these things did not come just all of a sudden during the thematic day. It has to have a different months of dialogue and discussions with all stakeholders to be ready to come to the table.
In our brief conversation together today, you've mentioned inclusivity a number of times, and I think reflecting on the loss and damage and the success in advancing that during Egypt's presidency of COP27, maybe as a reflection of the voice of the Global South really finding harmony and consolidating around action for a much broader constitution of the world. I want to think about the idea of inclusivity. Many in advance of COP27 referred to it as the African COP. Yes, people are being pushed into energy poverty because of the energy crises of today, but on the continent, 600 million people without access to reliable energy to begin with. How do we continue to reflect on the needs of, transitioning, sure, to a carbon net zero future, sure, but actually in many parts of the world, a transition to having access to energy to begin with, and having access to economic opportunity and dignity as people first. How do we balance those two issues?
This is a very difficult question to answer in the first place, because if we were able to solve that question in the last 8 years or 10 years since we had the Paris Agreement, things would have been much more better today in our world. But one important part of that balance between the needs of the vulnerable community, getting them out of the extreme poverty, and doing that energy transition is changing the whole strategies and the way we are dealing with the multilateralism. The multilateralism has been at a very intensive stage of the global south and the global north. We need to change the way multilateralism being focused on not only on diplomacy and political aspects, but also what is the human-centered approach that can be at the heart of the multilateralism. We tried in the COP27 to do that by exemplifying the green zone and the different spokespeople that were speaking about the thematic days. But at the multilateralism, we need to change how multilateralism is functioning. We need to reform really the MDBs and how they are financing, because their finance is not only on the private sector, they have a bigger role on the small and medium enterprises. And this is how you are picking up the vulnerable people out of poverty. For example, a very good example of that, those living as farmers in the rural communities. If you are able to bring them out of poverty, providing job opportunity by constructing and establishing a biogas unit that provides a clean source of renewable energy, you are getting them out of poverty, giving them a job opportunity, and yet doing that kind of an energy transition. These kinds of innovative and creative ideas will not be able to flourish and really have a multiplier effect without changing the overall system of the multilateralism, of having the human at the heart of that and reconciling the sustainable development and the climate. It's not either or. It's not SDGs or the climate agenda. It's not mitigation or adaptation. It has to be all mingled together in a way that would push the humanity forward with more economic profit that still keeps the natural resources alive and available.
Well, so a key feature of COP28 this year is a focus on MDB reform. So there is multilateral reform on the agenda. Do you think that there are opportunities, even if that's a microcosm of the overall multilateral complex, do you think there's opportunities to see that kind of change in philosophy and thinking through platforms like MDB reform in general?
It's difficult to have that kind of a reform in 1 year because of the historic practices of the MDBs and how they have been financing sustainability in climate and the way they are dealing and the differentiation even between the UN and the MDBs. But there is an important point that if we were able to put at the heart of the MDBs, that would be very important, which is how can they ensure de-risking all the climate and sustainability programs at the regional level before even digging at the national level. We always overlook that part. We always look at the NDC and the national part. We look at the strategic part of the global south and the global north at the negotiation part. But that regional perspective, if looked at, I think that would make really a huge difference in the way we're financing our challenges, especially when regions like the Mediterranean, like the Arab region or MENA region or Africa would really be consolidated into looking into that. And that would be really an important step if we were able to do that at COP28.
So as we start to wrap up our time, I want to reflect a little bit deeper on this idea of inclusivity and opportunity. One of the strongest memories I have from COP27 in the Blue Zone was when you walked from one hall to another. I don't remember which one, but you walked in the door, and a woman throughout the week, with help, painted a gorgeous mural that celebrated the role of youth. I think it also facilitated some conversation about women as well, but women and youth, and painting this picture, and it really brought this community around to talk about those issues. Clearly, the UAE is named the first ever youth champion for COP. What does it mean to you for inclusivity of those specific communities, and perhaps even a little bit deeper, what does it mean to the region to be thinking about youth as well in the context of climate change?
Youth is very important because they are the game changer into that part. For Egypt in COP27, when we even announced the first climate youth envoy as part of our presidency, that was important to bring those who are able to start that dialogue closer to each other, not the decision maker, not the president, not the envoy, but rather those who can talk to each other. Secondly, having them in the process together with the women and even with the civil society did make a huge difference in the way we were designing the thematic days. Because if we designed those parts only from the technical perspective or the finance or technology, without the real game changer and those who are impacted the most a part of that process, that will not really make a big difference. So I think that UAE and having youth at the heart of the climate discussion, preparing for that, having the youth pavilion, having the youth day, and even having the youth conference, then the Yongo, as part of the COP would be really very useful and will be building that momentum, especially that out of COP26, we had that as part of an integral decision, a formal decision, rather than just being at the sideline talking.
Well, Minister Fouad, it's always a pleasure, and I want to give you the final word. We have an audience here with the World Government Summit. If you were to give them a charge, many people have an impact and a thumbprint on the COP28 conversation. If you were to give this community a charge today, what would be your charge to them, and how can we continue to maintain momentum together?
Maintaining momentum would simply mean commitment, would mean persistent, and hard work and science. But one thing that really could keep the momentum going is women and girls leading that process, because they are the most affected and they can make a huge difference. So always believe that women and girls, in your deep heart inside, you will be able to fight climate change and you will win that just because you are a woman and you're suffering most. So you will be able to overcome the challenges and lead the way over to our future generations.
Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking Minister Fouad, Minister of Environment in Egypt. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.